Good evening, humble viewer, and welcome back to this quiet space, a small pocket of time carved out just for you. I am so glad you are here. Before we begin our journey tonight, I invite you to find a comfortable position. Let your head rest softly on your pillow. Allow your arms and your legs to feel heavy, to release any tension they might be holding from the day. Take a slow, deep breath, and as you exhale, feel the weight of the world settle, just for a little while. Let it drift away. There is nothing you need to do right now, nowhere you need to be other than right here in this calm. Our channel and our quiet community is made up of listeners from all across the globe, all tuning in at different moments of their day or night. It's a rather wonderful thought that as you are settling in for the night in one part of the world, another listener might be just starting their day, or perhaps taking a quiet moment in the middle of a busy afternoon. We are all connected by this shared desire for a little bit of peace. And so, as we begin to settle in, I would invite you, if you feel so inclined, to leave a small comment, letting us know where in the world you are listening from and what time it is for you. There is no need to do so if it disturbs your rest, of course. But it can be a comforting thought to see the quiet roll call of fellow listeners all gathered in this space together, from London to Los Angeles, from Sydney to Stockholm. It is a reminder that you are not alone in your search for stillness. Now, as your breathing slows and the world outside these sounds begins to fade, let us turn our minds back through the centuries, back to a time when the concepts of night and day, of light and darkness, were profoundly different from our own. We are going to explore the world of the medieval winter, a season of profound and brutal hardship. And to truly understand why it was so difficult, we must begin not with the ice or the snow, but with the one celestial body that governed all life, the sun. Our journey begins with a simple, almost childishly obvious truth, yet one whose implications were absolute and terrifying for the medieval peasant or villager. It is the tyranny of the sun, or more accurately, the tyranny of its absence. In our modern world, we have, for the most part, conquered the dark. With the flick of a switch, we can flood a room with clean, brilliant, artificial daylight. Our cities glow with a perpetual twilight, and our screens provide personal, portable suns that we hold in the palms of our hands. For us, darkness is a choice. We can turn the lights off to sleep or to watch a film, but we are always the masters of that darkness. The light is always there, waiting, a mere touch away. This was not the reality for our medieval ancestors. The setting of the sun was not an invitation to an evening of leisure. It was a final, non-negotiable curfew imposed upon the entire world. When the sun sank below the horizon, particularly during the long nights of winter, it took with it not just the light, but the ability to work, the ability to travel, and for many, the very feeling of safety itself. Let us try to imagine it. Let us place ourselves in a small, rural village in northern Europe, say in the 12th century. The year is drawing to a close. The harvest, hopefully a good one, is in. The days are growing noticeably, painfully shorter. The sun, which in June and July seemed like a benevolent, ever-present friend, now becomes a fleeting, distant stranger. It rises late, a pale, watery disk in a grey sky. It hangs low above the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows from the naked trees, and then, far too soon, it begins its descent, bleeding the colour from the world. For the peasant, the day of labour was dictated entirely by this meagre allotment of light. The phrase, "from dawn till dusk," was not a poetic expression. It was a literal and unyielding timetable. In the summer, this meant a grueling 16 or 17 hours of work in the fields. But in the winter, the usable day might shrink to a mere 7 or 8 hours. And these were not bright, clear hours. They were hours of perpetual twilight, of a landscape leached of warmth and vibrancy. As the light failed, usually in the mid-afternoon, a great retreat would begin. The farmer would guide his plough oxen back towards the shared barn. The shepherd would hurry his flock into the relative safety of a pen. The woodsman, who had been gathering precious firewood, would shoulder his load and begin the trek home before the paths became invisible and treacherous. The entire world of human activity would physically shrink, contracting from the fields and forests back to the clustered, huddled sanctuary of the village. And then the darkness would fall. it is difficult for us to truly comprehend the quality of this darkness. It was not the gentle, star-dusted dark of a modern countryside, free from city lights. It was a profound, deep, and palpable blackness, a heavy blanket of nothing that swallowed the landscape whole. On a night with a clear sky and a full moon, there might be a ghostly, silvered light that offered some visibility, but on the far more common nights of thick cloud or falling snow or freezing fog, the darkness was absolute. To step outside the door of one's hovel was to step into a void. The world that had been familiar by day became alien and menacing by night. The small path to a neighbour's cottage, a journey of a few dozen steps in the summer, now became a perilous expedition, fraught with the danger of a twisted ankle in a frozen rut or simply becoming disoriented in the oppressive blackness. The comforting sounds of the village, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the lowing of cattle, the shouts of children were extinguished, replaced by the sounds of the winter night. There was the wind, a relentless, keening howl that seemed to search for every crack and gap in the walls of the small dwellings. It was a sound that spoke of an immense and hostile power just outside. There was the sharp, sudden crack of a tree branch, succumbing to the frost. And sometimes, in the deep silence between gusts of wind, there was the distant cry of a wolf. For the medieval mind, steeped in folklore and a very real understanding of the dangers of the wild, the wolf was not just an animal. It was a creature of the dark, a physical embodiment of the hunger and threat that the winter represented. The night belonged to them and to other, less tangible fears. Inside the typical peasant home, a one-room structure often shared with livestock for warmth, the battle against the encroaching darkness was a feeble one. The primary source of light would have been the central hearth, the fire. But this was not the roaring, cheerful fireplace we might imagine. It was a smoky, moody, and precious resource. Fuel was a constant concern. Wood had to be gathered and dried, a task that became harder and harder as the winter wore on. Peasants had rights, known as estover, to gather fallen wood from the Lord's forests, but they could not fell healthy trees. As the winter progressed, this deadfall would become scarce, forcing them to burn whatever they could find: peat, dried turf, or even dried animal dung. Each of these fuels produced its own quality of light and smoke. A wood fire might provide a flickering, dancing light, casting restless shadows on the rough walls of the hovel. But it also produced a great deal of smoke which, in a house with no proper chimney and only a small hole in the thatched roof, would fill the room with an acrid, eye-watering haze. The air would be thick and difficult to breathe, a constant irritant to the lungs. Other sources of light were luxuries. Tallow candles made from rendered animal fat were available, but they were expensive for a poor family to make or buy. The fat was a source of calories, a vital part of the winter diet, and to burn it for light was a significant sacrifice. These candles also smelled unpleasant as they burned, and they gave off a greasy smoke, sputtering and offering only a small, weak pool of yellow light. A single candle might be all a family had to illuminate the entire room, its tiny flame a fragile defense against the immense darkness pressing in from outside. Beeswax candles were far superior. They burned cleanly, brightly, and smelled sweet, but they were a luxury reserved for the church and the very wealthy. The light of God in the great cathedrals was literally purer and brighter than the light available to the common person. The soft, clean glow of beeswax was a symbol of divine presence and worldly power. The peasant's light was smelly, smoky, and weak. So, picture the scene inside this hovel after the sun has set. The family is gathered around the hearth. The air is thick with smoke. A single, sputtering tallow candle does little to push back the deep shadows that cling to the corners of the room. The world outside has ceased to exist, replaced by sound and imagination. The wind howls. The wooden frame of the house groans under the strain. What could a family do in these long hours of darkness? Their activities were limited by the poor light. Men might attempt to mend tools or repair leather harnesses, holding the objects close to the fire, their faces etched in the flickering orange glow, their hands stiff with cold. Women would engage in the endless vital task of textile production, combing, spinning, and weaving wool or flax. Spinning with a drop spindle was a task that could be done almost by feel, a rhythmic, repetitive motion that could continue in the semi-darkness. These textiles were not just for clothing, they were a form of currency, a vital part of the household economy. But these tasks were difficult. The poor light would have strained the eyes, and the ever-present cold would have made fingers numb and clumsy. There would be storytelling, the passing on of oral traditions, folk tales, and village gossip. Grandparents would recite the old stories, tales of saints and heroes, of fairies and goblins, stories that blurred the line between entertainment and genuine belief. These stories populated the darkness with beings both benevolent and malevolent, shaping the psychological landscape of the night. The church, too, played a significant role in structuring this time. The liturgical calendar provided a framework for the passing of the dark season. Advent was the season of waiting, of penance and anticipation for the coming of the light, the birth of Christ. Christmas itself, strategically placed near the winter solstice, was a celebration of light in the deepest dark. It co-opted older pagan traditions like Yule, which were themselves rituals designed to acknowledge the death of the sun and plead for its rebirth. The burning of the Yule log was a powerful piece of sympathetic magic, a great offering of fire and light to encourage the sun to return. For the medieval peasant, the Christian narrative and the older pagan anxieties were woven together. The fear that the sun might not return with its full strength was a deep, primal one, and the celebrations of midwinter were not just a party, but a necessary psychological and spiritual bulwark against despair. This shrinking of the world, this enforced idleness in the dark, had a profound psychological effect. Summer was a time of communal activity in the open fields. Winter drove everyone indoors, into cramped, smoky, and often tense quarters. The same small group of people, day after day, night after night, for months on end. The monotony must have been immense. The modern affliction of cabin fever would have been a pervasive seasonal reality. The very concept of time would have felt different. Without clocks, time was measured by the sun, the church bells, and the tasks at hand. In winter, with the sun's journey so short and the tasks so limited, time itself must have seemed to slow down, to become thick and stagnant. Each day was a near-perfect replica of the one before, a few hours of grey light and toil, followed by an eternity of darkness and waiting. Waiting for the light, waiting for the warmth, waiting for the world to grow large again. The medieval winter was brutal not merely because of the cold, but because of the dark. The darkness was a thief. It stole time, it stole productivity, it stole community, and it stole the feeling of safety. It dictated the rhythm of life and death. It confined people to their homes and to the dim, smoky worlds within their own minds, worlds populated by faith, fear, and folklore. This fundamental reality, the overwhelming power of the winter darkness and the feebleness of humanity's attempts to counter it, is the foundation upon which all the other hardships of the season were built. The cold was more dangerous because you could not see to find more fuel. The hunger was more acute because the monotonous dark hours dragged on, filled with little to do but feel the emptiness in your stomach. Sickness was more terrifying because the healer could not travel in the dark, and the patient lay in a smoky room, unable to distinguish fever dreams from the shadowy reality. And so the world shrank, bound not by maps or fences, but by the simple, brutal tyranny of a low-hanging sun. It was this darkness, this fundamental lack of light and warmth, that formed the first and perhaps most formidable wall of the medieval winter prison. And as we continue our journey, we will see how this initial hardship of darkness compounded every other challenge that the season would bring. For now, just rest. Rest in your own comfortable space, a space of warmth and gentle light, and let the deep, profound darkness of the past remain just a story, just a sound in the quiet of your room. The cold of a medieval winter was not simply an inconvenience. It was an active, aggressive force, an enemy that laid siege to every village, every home, and every individual for months on end. For us, in our centrally heated homes, wrapped in modern lightweight thermal fabrics, the cold is something we venture out into. For our medieval ancestors, the cold was something that came inside with them. It was a constant, unwelcome guest in their homes, in their beds, and in their very bones. Let us begin by considering the first and most important line of defense against this enemy, the home itself. For the vast majority of the population, the peasantry, the home was a simple 1- or 2-room structure, what we might call a hovel or a cottage. The construction of these dwellings was a testament to the resources available, which were modest at best. The frame would be made of timber, a technique known as cruck framing, where large, curved timbers formed the essential A-frame of the building. Between these timbers, the walls were filled in using a method called wattle and daub. Imagine the process. First, a lattice of thin, flexible wooden strips. The wattle was woven between the upright posts of the timber frame. This created a sort of basket-like structure for the walls. Then, the daub was applied. This was a crude plaster, a sticky, thick mixture of whatever was locally abundant. It was typically a combination of wet soil or clay, sand, straw for binding, and often animal dung, which added both cohesiveness and, surprisingly, a degree of insulation. This daub was smeared over and into the wattle lattice, by hand, and left to dry in the sun. In the warmth of summer, this was a reasonably effective structure. It was cheap to build and repair, using materials that were literally right at hand. But as winter approached, the inherent weaknesses of wattle and daub became terrifyingly apparent. The daub, being essentially dried mud, was vulnerable to moisture. A long, damp autumn would saturate the walls, making them feel clammy and cold. And then, when the first hard frosts arrived, the water within the daub would freeze. As water freezes, it expands. This expansion would create a network of tiny cracks throughout the walls. With each cycle of freezing and thawing, these cracks would widen, allowing the wind to find its way inside. So the very air that was meant to protect the family from the cold was itself wounded by the cold. The wind, which we heard howling outside in our previous imaginings, was not just a sound. It was a physical presence inside the H-home. It would snake through these myriad cracks in the walls, creating persistent, chilling drafts. There was no escaping it. A family might try to plug the worst of the gaps with rags or moss or more mud, but it was a losing battle. The cold was insidious. It would always find a way in. Next, consider the roof. The typical peasant's roof was thatched, made from overlapping bundles of straw or reeds tied down to the roof frame. A well-maintained thick thatch could be remarkably waterproof and a decent insulator. But well-maintained was the key. Thatch required regular repair and replacement, and over time it would compact, rot, and become a welcoming home for mice, rats, and insects. A heavy, wet snow sitting on the roof for weeks would slowly melt and drip, not in one predictable leak, but in dozens of small, irritating places throughout the single room. The floor beneath would become a patchwork of damp spots and mud, and the floor itself was the final vulnerability. There were no wooden floorboards for a common peasant. The floor was simply the earth itself, packed down hard through years of use. In some cases, it might be strewn with reeds or straw for a bit of comfort and to soak up spills and mess, but this covering would quickly become sodden and filthy. An earthen floor is a massive heat sink. It remains at a near constant, cool temperature, and it will relentlessly draw warmth from anything placed upon it. It would suck the heat from the hearth fire, from the bodies of the livestock, and most importantly, from the feet and bodies of the people trying to sleep upon it. The feeling of a damp, penetrating cold rising up from the ground itself would have been a constant reality. So this was the medieval shelter, a timber frame with cracked mud walls, a potentially leaky roof, and a cold, damp earth floor. It was less a barrier against the cold and more of a sieve. Now, let us step inside this fragile shelter, into the smoky, dim interior we have already pictured. The family is huddled together, seeking warmth from the second line of defense, the fire. As we noted, the fire was typically a central, open hearth. This position was strategic. It allowed the heat to radiate outwards in all directions, and it allowed the smoke a central point from which to, hopefully, exit through a hole in the roof. But the efficiency of such a fire as a heat source was staggeringly low. The vast majority of the thermal energy produced by the burning wood went straight up with the smoke. Only radiant heat, the heat you can feel on your skin when you are close to the flames, was of any real use. This created a room of extreme microclimates. If you were sitting directly beside the hearth, your front might be roasting, while your back, just a few feet away from the drafty wall, remained freezing cold. To be warm was to be in the smoke. To escape the smoke was to be in the cold. There was no happy medium. The entire family and any animals sharing the dwelling would crowd as close as they dared to the embers. This proximity was not just for comfort, it was for survival. And this brings us to the most critical element of winter warmth: fuel. The fire was life, but it was a life that needed to be constantly fed. The struggle for firewood was a central defining labor of the winter months. A peasant typically had the right of estover, as we mentioned, which allowed them to gather fallen branches and deadwood from the Lord's forests. In early autumn, this might be a manageable task, but imagine the landscape in deep winter. The ground is covered in a thick blanket of snow. The deadwood is buried, frozen to the ground. Every single branch has to be found, dug out, and broken free. The work was brutal. A peasant would venture out into the grey, freezing day, into the silent, snow-laden woods. Their clothing, as we will soon see, was inadequate. Their hands would become numb, their feet blocks of ice inside crude leather shoes, likely stuffed with straw for insulation. They would spend hours searching for, gathering, and then hauling this precious fuel back to the village, often on their own backs, or on a small handcart if they were fortunate. And the wood they gathered was often damp or green, meaning it would produce more smoke and less heat when it was burned. To have a stock of dry, seasoned firewood was a mark of a well-prepared and fortunate household. For most, it was a daily struggle to find enough fuel to get through the next night. This scarcity meant that the fire was managed with extreme care. It would be kept low, a pile of glowing embers rather than a roaring blaze to conserve wood. It was a common practice to bank the fire at night, covering the embers with ash to keep them alive until morning. The first task upon waking in the freezing darkness would be to gently uncover these embers and coax them back to life with kindling and breath. If the fire went out completely, it was a small disaster. It meant using a precious flint and steel to create a spark, a difficult task with numb fingers, or taking a burning brand to a neighbor's cottage to borrow a light, a journey that was itself a challenge in the pre-dawn cold and dark. The home was a sieve, and the fire was a weak, hungry heart within it. The final layer of protection was what a person wore on their own body. Let us examine the wardrobe of a typical 12th or 13th century peasant. The primary fabric was wool. Sheep were everywhere in the medieval economy, and their fleece was the cornerstone of clothing for all social classes. After being sheared, the wool was cleaned, combed, spun into thread by the women of the household, and then woven into a rough, scratchy cloth known as homespun. The basic garments were simple and functional. A man would wear a linen shirt or undertunic, if he could afford one, directly against his skin. Over this, he would wear a coat, a long-sleeve woolen tunic that reached to his knees or mid-thigh. His legs would be covered either by simple trousers, known as brays, or by separate leggings called chaussees, which were tied to a belt at the waist. A woman's clothing was similar, but her tunic would be floor length. Over this, both men and women would have a cloak or mantle, a simple rectangle or semicircle of heavier wool, fastened at the neck with a pin or a tie. On their feet, they wore simple shoes or ankle boots made of leather with thin, flexible soles. This was, for many, the entirety of their wardrobe. One set of clothes, worn day in and day out. These garments were a person's second skin. They were rarely, if ever, washed during the winter. Washing meant dousing them in cold water with harsh lye soap and then facing the near impossible task of drying them. A heavy woolen tunic could take days to dry indoors, hanging in the smoky air near the hearth. During that time, a person would have nothing else to wear. So, clothes were simply not washed. They became stiff with dirt, sweat, and grease. This grime, ironically, may have added a marginal layer of windproofing, but the garments would have been incredibly smelly and abrasive against the skin. The insulating properties of this clothing were limited. Wool is a fantastic insulator, with the unique property of retaining much of its warmth even when wet. This was crucial. However, The weave of homespun cloth was often loose, allowing wind to penetrate. And the design of the clothing, tunics and cloaks, was not form-fitting, allowing precious body heat to escape and cold drafts to enter. Getting wet was a constant danger. A peasant working outside, caught in a winter rain or sleet, would become soaked. Their heavy woolen cloak would absorb the water, becoming incredibly heavy and cold. Returning home, they would face the misery of trying to dry out by the weak fire. The feeling of wearing damp, cold wool, which steams and releases a pungent animal smell as it warms, was a universal winter experience. It was a clammy, chilling embrace that could sap the body's energy and lead directly to sickness. Now, contrast this with the clothing of the wealthy. A lord or a lady would also wear wool, but it would be of a much finer quality, woven tightly and dyed in rich colors. More importantly, they wore layers, multiple tunics and overgarments lined with fur. Furs like squirrel, marten, and for the highest nobility, ermine, were not just for show, they were for warmth. Fur is an exceptional insulator, trapping air and creating a barrier of warmth that a peasant could only dream of. The wealthy also had multiple sets of clothes and servants to care for them. They had the luxury of being clean and warm. Warmth, like bright, clean light, was a profound and visible marker of status. So let us put all these pieces together and imagine the direct physical experience of the cold. Imagine waking up in the morning. It is still completely dark. The fire has been banked and the room is almost as cold inside as it is outside. Your breath plumes in the air, a small white cloud in the darkness. The thatch above your head is stiff with frost. The walls are slick with frozen condensation. You are huddled under a rough woolen blanket, perhaps a straw-filled mattress if you are lucky, but more likely just a pile of straw on the cold earth floor. You must get up. You pull on your clothes, which are cold and feel damp to the touch. Your fingers are stiff and clumsy. Your first task is to revive the fire, the life of the household. Then a meager breakfast, perhaps a piece of hard bread and some weak ale. And then you must go outside. The shock of the wind hitting your face is like a physical blow. You must go out to tend to the animals, to check your stores, or to begin the grueling search for more firewood. For those who had to work outside, the physical toll was immense. The cold made muscles stiff and slow to respond. It made tools difficult to grip. The risk of frostbite was ever present. Fingers, toes, ears, and the nose, deprived of warm blood, could freeze, turning white and numb. If not treated quickly by slow rewarming, the tissue would die, turning black and leading to gangrene and amputation or death. But even for those who could stay inside, the cold was a constant torment. It manifested as a deep, relentless ache in the joints, a misery for the old or those with arthritis. It caused chilblains, painful, itching swellings on the hands and feet caused by repeated exposure to cold. And it was a drain on the body's most precious resource, calories. This is a crucial point that links the cold to the next great hardship we will discuss: hunger. A body fighting the cold is like a furnace burning at full blast. It consumes energy at a tremendous rate simply to maintain its core temperature. This means that a person in the medieval winter needed to consume significantly more calories than they would in the summer just to stay level. But they were entering a season where food was at its most scarce. They were being asked to fuel their internal furnace more at the exact moment the fuel supply was dwindling. This created a devastating feedback loop. The colder you got, the hungrier you became. And the hungrier you were, the less able your body was to generate heat, making you even colder. This vicious cycle of cold and hunger was a spiral that could easily lead to sickness and death. The unrelenting cold was more than just a discomfort. It was a force that weakened the defenses of the home, that demanded constant, back-breaking labor for fuel, that made every moment, awake or asleep, a struggle to retain a flicker of bodily warmth. It was an enemy that attacked from without and from within, draining strength, energy, and hope. It was a siege that lasted for months, a siege whose greatest ally was the encroaching famine of the winter larder. For now, however, just feel the warmth of your own bed, the comfort of your own still and quiet room. There is no wind here, there is no damp, there is only peace. We have touched upon the great anxieties of the medieval winter, the profound, encroaching darkness, and the relentless, seeping cold. These two forces created the stage for the third and most central drama of the season, a slow-motion tragedy played out in every cottage and castle across the land. This was the tragedy of hunger. It was not an event, but a condition, not an acute pain, but a chronic, grinding ache that defined existence for months on end. To truly comprehend its brutality, we must unpack it layer by layer, starting with the moment of fleeting hope, the harvest. The entire medieval year was a prayer to the harvest. The agricultural calendar, which was the only calendar that truly mattered to 90% of the population, was a sequence of labors all aimed at that one climactic event in late summer. From the spring ploughing, a grueling ordeal of guiding a heavy wooden plough pulled by a team of exhausted oxen through wet, heavy soil, to the careful sowing of the precious seed, to the endless summer task of weeding, the entire community's energy was poured into the soil. Their lives were wagered on the sun and the rain. Let us imagine the weeks leading up to the harvest. This was a time of supreme anxiety. The grain, whether it was wheat, rye, barley, or oats, stood tall in the fields, its heads heavy and turning from green to gold. It was the physical embodiment of the year's potential wealth, but it was still incredibly vulnerable. A week of heavy, driving rain could pound the stalks into the mud, a condition called lodging from which they would never recover, rotting where they lay. A hailstorm, even one lasting only a few minutes, could shatter the ripening grain heads, effectively threshing the crop onto the ground where it was lost forever. A prolonged drought could have withered the crop weeks earlier, resulting in thin, meager ears with tiny grains. The peasants would have watched the sky with a mixture of hope and terror, their fate resting on the whims of the clouds. But let us grant our village a successful season. The weather holds. The Lord's Reeve, the manor's manager, declares the crop ready. The signal is given and the reap begins. This was not a gentle, pastoral activity. It was a frantic, desperate mobilization of every available hand. The men moved through the fields in lines, swinging sickles, the short, curved blades, or the longer, more efficient scythes. It was back-breaking work, bent over from dawn until dusk. The women and older children followed behind, gathering the cut stalks and binding them into sheaves or bundles. Their hands would be raw and cut from the sharp edges of the stalks and the coarse binding twine. Even the youngest children had a role, a practice called gleaning. After the reapers had passed, the children would be allowed to scour the fields, picking up any individual stalks or heads of grain that had been dropped. Every single grain was precious, and the handfuls collected by the gleaners could mean the difference between life and death for a family in the deep winter. Once cut and bound, the sheaves were stood up in conical arrangements to allow the air to circulate and ensure the grain was perfectly dry before being brought to the threshing floor. Then came the second great reckoning. The entire harvest, the sum total of the village's labor and fortune, was brought to a central, communal point. And here, the peasant was forced to watch as his wealth, his food, his very life force was divided and diminished before he could claim his own. The first to claim his share was the lord of the manor. This was not a simple transaction. The lord's reeve or bailiff, a figure of immense authority and often resentment, would be present to oversee the division. He would assess the total yield, and the lord's portion, known as the rent in kind, would be taken. This was often a staggering amount, sometimes as much as half the crop. The peasants would watch as cart after cart was loaded with their sheaves and trundled away to the Lord's Grange, a massive, imposing barn, often built of stone, with thick walls and a strong roof designed to protect the Lord's wealth from weather, rats, and the hungry peasants themselves. This division was the cold, hard reality of the feudal contract, their labor for his land and protection. Next came the church. The tithe, or tenth part, was a religious and legal obligation. A representative of the parish priest would be there to claim one sheaf out of every 10. These were taken to the tithe barn, another large and well-built structure, often the most impressive building in the village besides the church itself. To withhold the tithe was not just to cheat the priest, it was to steal from God, a sin that carried the weight of eternal damnation. Finally, the most painful deduction of all, the seed for next year. The community, under the watchful eye of the reeve and the village elders, had to select the best quality grain and set it aside. This seed represented the future. It was the promise of another harvest, another chance at life. To eat the seed corn, even in the deepest pangs of starvation, was the ultimate taboo. It was a communal suicide pact. Folklore was filled with grim tales of villages that had eaten their seed corn only to be wiped out by the ensuing famine, a lesson that was deeply ingrained in the medieval psyche. Only after these 3 portions were removed could the peasant finally take what was left. He would look at his diminished pile of sheaves, the product of a year of toil, and know that this was it. This had to sustain his family through the coming dark months. The race was not over, it had just begun. Now, let us follow the peasant's grain. It had to be threshed to separate the edible grain from the stalk and husk. This was done by beating the sheaves with a flail, a tool consisting of 2 pieces of wood joined by a leather thong. It was rhythmic, exhausting work, often done on a hard-packed earthen floor inside a barn or shed. The air would be thick with dust and chaff, irritating the lungs and eyes. Once threshed, the grain was winnowed, thrown into the air so the wind would carry away the lighter chaff, leaving the heavier grains to fall onto a sheet below. Finally, the peasant had his hoard of clean grain. It was stored in sacks, or in a wooden bin or stone-lined pit inside his cottage, where he had to constantly guard it against damp, which could cause it to rot or sprout, and from the relentless foraging of mice and rats. This grain was the foundation of the winter diet, primarily consumed as bread. To make bread, the grain had to be milled into flour. The peasant was forbidden from milling it himself with a simple hand quern. He was legally obligated to take his grain to the Lord's mill and pay the miller to grind it. This was a source of constant friction. The journey to the mill could be long and arduous, and millers were universally distrusted figures in medieval society, widely believed to be thieves who would take an excessive portion of the flour as their payment, or tamper with the scales. The miller in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales is a classic example, a brawny, cheating, foul-mouthed bully. Yet the peasant had no choice. He would hand over his precious sack of grain and receive back a smaller sack of flour, his stomach tightening with suspicion. The flour itself was coarse, a whole grain flour full of bran and grit. It was mixed with water, a little salt if available, and a starter culture of yeast saved from the last baking or from brewing ale. Kneading this heavy, dense dough was physically demanding work for the women of the household. The loaf produced was not light and airy. It was a heavy, dense, dark round of bread with a thick, hard crust. We call it maslin bread when made from a mix of wheat and rye, or even coarser breads from barley or oats. This bread was the centerpiece of every meal. It was dense, filling, and required strong teeth and jaws to chew. The grit from the millstones would remain in the flour, and over a lifetime it would wear down the enamel of the teeth, leading to decay, abscesses, and tooth loss. So even this staff of life was an agent of chronic pain. The second pillar of the diet was the pottage pot, the great cauldron that hung over the hearth. Let us chart the decline of the pottage through the season. In the early autumn, it might be a thing of relative richness. Into the simmering base of boiled grains would go the last of the kitchen garden's bounty. Fat onions, sweet carrots, sturdy parsnips, leeks, and perhaps some cabbage. A bone from the autumn slaughter might be added, leaching its flavor and marrow into the broth. This was the pottage of plenty. By midwinter, the fresh vegetables are a distant memory. The pottage is now based on dried ingredients. Dried peas or beans, which had been harvested and stored, might be added. These required long soaking and boiling, but added much-needed protein. The primary vegetable would be the cabbage, a hardy plant that could be harvested late into the season and stored for some time. The flavor would come from a handful of dried herbs gathered in the summer and the crucial ingredient of salt. By the hungry gap of late winter and early spring, the pottage becomes a thin, watery gruel. The dried peas are gone. The last of the cabbages has been eaten. Now it is little more than oats or barley boiled in water. It is at this point that the women would venture out to find anything green that might be pushing through the cold earth. Young nettle tops, carefully gathered to avoid their sting and boiled to neutralize it, were a common famine food, providing vital iron and vitamins. Wild garlic, dandelions, and other weeds were desperately sought to add some flavor and substance to the pathetic, simmering pot. Protein was the luxury that marked the passage of winter most starkly. The autumn slaughter of surplus pigs and cattle provided a brief period of feasting, but this fresh meat had to be preserved immediately. The primary method was salting. Salt was a precious commodity. Coastal communities could produce it by evaporating seawater in shallow pans, but for inland villages, it had to be mined and transported, making it expensive. A family would use a significant portion of its resources to acquire enough coarse, grey salt for the winter preservation. The meat was cut into strips or chunks and packed into a wooden barrel or earthenware pot with thick layers of salt in between. The salt drew out the moisture, the lifeblood of bacteria, creating an environment where the meat would not spoil. The result was an intensely saline, incredibly tough and leathery product. Before it could be eaten, a piece of salt beef had to be soaked in water for many hours, with the water being changed repeatedly to make it even remotely palatable. Even then, it was a hard, chewy substance that bore little resemblance to fresh meat. Smoking was another method. Strips of meat or fish, particularly oily fish like herring, would be hung in the smoky rafters of the cottage. The constant exposure to the smoke from the hearth would slowly cure the meat, the chemicals in the smoke acting as a preservative and flavoring agent. This produced a dry, hard, heavily flavored product that, like salted meat, could last for months. To eat a meal with a sliver of this salt pork or smoked herring was the highlight of a winter day. It provided fat and a powerful flavor that could make the bland bread and pottage more bearable. But as the weeks ground on, the barrel of salted meat would get emptier. The strings of smoked fish would dwindle, the portions would get smaller and then disappear altogether. The diet would revert to its monotonous base of grain, a diet dangerously low in essential nutrients. And this is where the invisible assault of malnutrition began. The lack of vitamin C from fresh fruits and vegetables led to scurvy. Let us visualize its progression in slow, clinical detail. It begins not with bleeding gums, but with a profound and deep fatigue, a weariness in the bones that could easily be mistaken for simple winter blues. Then the joints begin to ache, a deep, throbbing pain. Small, dark red spots, like tiny blood blisters called petechiae, appear on the skin, particularly on the legs. The gums, starved of the collagen that vitamin C helps produce, begin to soften and swell. They turn a dark, purplish red and bleed at the slightest touch. The breath becomes foul with the smell of decay. Then, the teeth, their sockets disintegrating, loosen and fall out one by one. Old scars, even from childhood injuries, might mysteriously reopen as the body loses its ability to maintain tissue. The sufferer becomes weak, despondent, and eventually, if no source of vitamin C is found, succumbs to internal bleeding. The lack of vitamin A would lead to night blindness, a terrifying affliction in a world already so dark. The lack of iron led to chronic anemia, a constant state of exhaustion and shortness of breath, where every small task felt like climbing a mountain. And the overall lack of calories and protein weakened the immune system to the point of collapse. A body in a state of semi-starvation cannot produce the white blood cells and antibodies needed to fight off infection. A simple cough would linger for weeks, deepening into a fatal pneumonia. A small cut from a knife or tool, instead of healing, would fester, becoming a gateway for gangrene. Dysentery, spreading through a village weakened by hunger, was an unstoppable firestorm. The psychological toll was just as severe. Hunger grinds away at the spirit. It creates an obsession. All thoughts, all dreams revolve around food. It shortens the temper, making people irritable and prone to conflict. In the cramped, smoky confines of the hovel, a family weakened by hunger would find their bonds of affection frayed and worn thin by constant, low-level misery and suspicion. Who was getting a slightly larger piece of bread? Who was not doing their share of the work to conserve energy? This anxiety radiated outwards into the community. The hungry gap was the time of greatest social tension. The sight of smoke rising from a neighbor's chimney could be interpreted not as a sign of life, but as a sign that they had fuel, and therefore, perhaps, a secret hoard of food. Theft became more common and was punished with brutal severity. The social cohesion that was so vital for survival could crumble under the relentless pressure of empty stomachs. This was the nature of medieval hunger. It was a slow, systematic dismantling of the human being from the inside out. It was a countdown, measured by the level of grain in the bin, a countdown to the hungry gap where the only foods left were the foods of desperation: boiled leather, ground tree bark, and bitter weeds. It was the backdrop to all other winter miseries, making the cold feel colder, the dark feel darker, and sickness an almost certain death sentence. Now, let that world of hunger and want dissolve. It is just a story, a whisper from a long-forgotten time. You are here, in your own quiet space. You are warm, you are safe, you are comfortable. There is no hunger here. There is only stillness and the gentle invitation to let go, to release your mind into the soft, quiet darkness of a peaceful sleep. We have explored the physical prison of the medieval winter, a world defined by the tyranny of darkness, the assault of the cold, and the slow, grinding torture of hunger. These three forces, working in a brutal synergy, created the perfect conditions for the flourishing of the fourth great trial of the season: sickness. Disease was not merely a feature of medieval life. It was an ever-present shadow, a constant companion. But in the winter, this shadow grew long and dark, enveloping communities in a miasma of fear, suffering, and a profound sense of helplessness, all rooted in a worldview that was profoundly different from our own. To truly grasp the terror of winter sickness, we must first dismantle our modern understanding of medicine and inhabit the medieval mind. For us, disease is, for the most part, a solvable problem, an equation with variables we can identify and manipulate. We have the germ theory, a conceptual revolution that allows us to visualize our enemies: bacteria, viruses, fungi, protozoa. We have microscopes to see them, antibiotics to kill them, vaccines to preempt them. Sickness for us is a biological process. For our medieval ancestors, it was a metaphysical one. It was a drama played out on a cosmic stage involving the body, the soul, the stars, and God. The dominant medical paradigm, as we have touched upon, was humoral theory. This ancient Greek framework, passed down through Roman and Arab scholars and enshrined as unassailable dogma, was the lens through which all bodily functions were viewed. The four humours, blood, sanguine, phlegm, phlegmatic, yellow bile, choleric, and black bile, melancholic, were not just abstract concepts. They were believed to be real, tangible fluids, each with its own character. Blood was hot and wet, associated with the element of air and the season of spring. Phlegm was cold and wet, linked to water and winter. Yellow bile was hot and dry, tied to fire and summer. Black bile was cold and dry, connected to earth and autumn. Health was eucrasia, the perfect, harmonious blending of these four fluids. Sickness was dyscrasia, an imbalance, and the winter, with its inherent qualities of being cold and wet, was seen as a season that naturally and dangerously promoted an excess of phlegm. This was not just a metaphor. The running nose, the wet cough, the production of sputum, these were seen as direct, physical evidence of the body being overwhelmed by the phlegmatic quality of the season. Every peasant, seeing their own breath plume in the frigid air, was witnessing what they believed to be a physical manifestation of the season's dangerous influence entering their body. This belief system dictated every aspect of prevention and cure. The guiding principle was allopathy, the idea of treating with opposites. To counteract the cold, wet influence of winter, one must actively seek out things that were hot and dry. This philosophy permeated the diet of those who could afford to choose. Spices, a luxury from the East, were not just flavorings, they were potent medicines. Pepper, cloves, nutmeg, ginger, all were considered intensely hot and dry, and were prescribed to counteract the phlegmatic tendencies of winter. A wealthy lord sipping his cup of mulled wine, wine being hot, infused with hot spices, was not just enjoying a festive drink, he was actively practicing preventative medicine, fortifying his body against the season's humoral assault. The peasant, meanwhile, subsisting on his watery pottage and coarse bread, both considered cool and moist foods, was, in the eyes of the learned, consuming a diet that left him dangerously susceptible to the very illnesses the season fostered. When sickness did strike, the treatments were a direct and often brutal application of this theory. A patient burning with a fever, a condition of excess heat, would be subjected to treatments designed to cool the body. But a lung fever, pneumonia, was a more complex problem. It involved a fever, heat, but was caused by an excess of phlegm, cold, and wet. The physician's task was to address this complex imbalance. This often led to the cornerstone of medieval medical practice, phlebotomy or bloodletting. The logic, though alien to us, was internally consistent. By removing blood, a hot and wet humor, a physician believed they could reduce the patient's overall heat while also reducing the total volume of fluid in the body, which they hoped would help drain the excess phlegm from the lungs. Let us visualize this procedure not in a clean, well-lit university hall, but in the grim reality of a peasant's hovel. The patient, a farmer, is lying on a bed of straw, delirious with fever, his breathing ragged and shallow. He is already profoundly weakened by weeks of malnutrition and the exhausting work of fighting the infection. The healer, perhaps a traveling barber surgeon with a fearsome array of unsterilized tools, arrives. The patient's arm is bound tightly with a strip of leather to make the veins bulge. The healer selects a lancet, a small sharp knife, from his roll. With a quick, practiced motion, he pierces the prominent vein at the elbow. The dark, vital blood, carrying what little oxygen and nutrients the man possessed, flows out into a shallow wooden bowl. The family watches in hushed silence, praying this procedure will work. The healer might measure the amount of blood removed by sight, or by having the patient hold a staff until he begins to feel faint, a sign that balance was being restored. What was actually happening was the induction of hypovolemic shock, a catastrophic loss of blood volume that would cripple the body's ability to fight the underlying infection. The patient, already on the brink, was being pushed decisively towards the grave, a victim of the very best medicine his age had to offer. Beyond humoral theory, the medieval mind was steeped in a belief system that saw the hand of God in every event. Sickness was rarely seen as a random occurrence. It was often interpreted as a direct punishment for sin. An individual's illness could be traced to a personal transgression, a lie, a theft, an act of impiety. A widespread epidemic like influenza or dysentery was seen as a sign of God's wrath upon the entire community for its collective failings. This belief fostered a sense of deep spiritual anxiety and guilt alongside the physical suffering. The response was not to seek biological causes, but spiritual ones. The community would be called to prayer and public acts of penance. They would process through the village, flagellating themselves, fasting and making solemn vows to God and the saints in the hope of appeasing the divine anger. The saints themselves were a crucial part of the celestial healthcare system. Specific saints were believed to have patronage over particular illnesses. Saint Anthony was invoked against skin diseases, known as Saint Anthony's fire, or ergotism. Saint Roche was the great protector against plague. Saint Blaise was prayed to for afflictions of the throat. A sick person's family would make desperate vows, promising a pilgrimage to a saint's shrine or a donation to the church if the saint would intercede on their behalf. The healing power was not in a medicine, but in a relic, a fragment of a saint's bone, a piece of their clothing, which was believed to contain a tangible echo of their spiritual power. And then there was the world of folklore, a universe of unseen but potent forces that coexisted with Christian belief. The darkness of the winter night was not empty. It was populated by goblins, demons, and malevolent fairies, the Aossi in Celtic lands, who were believed to steal the health of humans or snatch away healthy babies, leaving sickly changelings in their place. A sudden, wasting illness might not be God's will, but the result of a curse, the evil eye cast by an envious neighbor. Amulets and charms, a hagstone with a natural hole in it, a sprig of rowan wood, a piece of iron, were carried or hung in the home as protection against these unseen threats. The line between prayer and magic, between a relic and a charm, was often blurred. The world was a place of constant spiritual warfare, and sickness was often a sign that one's defenses had been breached. Now let us place this terrified metaphysical mindset into the physical incubator of the peasant's winter home. The one-room cottage was a microcosm of all the factors that breed disease. Air quality was abysmal. The constant smoke from the open hearth was a chronic irritant. Modern science has shown that inhaling wood smoke is deeply damaging to the lungs, causing inflammation, scarring, and destroying the tiny cilia that are responsible for clearing pathogens and debris. A medieval peasant from infancy to old age was breathing this toxic air for the 12 to 16 hours of darkness each winter day. Their lungs were in a permanent state of compromise, making them profoundly susceptible to infection. The term consumption, used for centuries to describe tuberculosis, paints a vivid picture of a disease that seemed to eat the lungs from within, a process aided and abetted by the smoky environment. The crowding was another critical factor. The principle of social distancing was an unimaginable luxury. The entire family and their livestock were packed together in a space perhaps no larger than a modern living room. They shared the same air, the same bedding, the same utensils. In this context, respiratory diseases like influenza, whooping cough, and pneumonia were not individual afflictions. They were household events. Once one person became sick, the pathogen would pass through the entire family with terrifying efficiency, a chain reaction of coughing, fever, and misery. The very act of huddling together for warmth, a basic survival instinct, became the mechanism of the disease's transmission. Hygiene was a concept that bore little resemblance to our own. The scarcity and difficulty of procuring water in winter meant that washing was infrequent at best. The earthen floor, a mixture of dirt, spilled food, and animal waste, was a haven for bacteria. The straw that covered it was rarely changed and would become a festering damp mat of filth. This created a perfect environment for gastrointestinal diseases. Dysentery, caused by bacteria like Shigella or E. coli, would spread rapidly. It caused severe diarrhea, often containing blood, leading to rapid dehydration and death. In a world without intravenous fluids or even a basic understanding of oral rehydration, a bout of dysentery was incredibly lethal, especially for infants and young children, whose smaller bodies would succumb quickly to fluid loss. The vermin that shared the cottage were not just a nuisance, they were vectors of death. Rats and mice, seeking food and shelter from the cold, infested every dwelling. They contaminated the precious food stores with their droppings and carried fleas. Fleas were the agents of the bubonic plague, but they also transmitted other diseases like murine typhus. Far more common were body lice. These tiny insects lived in the seams of the unwashed woolen clothing, right next to the skin. They were a constant torment, their bites causing a maddening itch, but they were also the carriers of epidemic typhus, a disease that thrives in cold conditions among crowded, unwashed populations. It causes high fever, delirium, and a characteristic rash, and has historically killed more soldiers in armies than combat. For a medieval village, huddled and louse-ridden in the depths of winter, an outbreak of typhus would be a catastrophe. Let us imagine the experience of a child falling ill. A young boy, perhaps 5 years old, develops a cough. At first, it's ignored, dismissed as a simple winter cold, but it worsens, becoming a deep barking cough that racks his small frame. He develops a high fever and becomes listless. The family gathers around, their faces etched with worry in the flickering firelight. They try the local remedies, a poultice of boiled onions on his chest, a broth made from herbs. They pray to Saint Blaise, but the boy's breathing becomes more difficult. They can hear a rattling sound in his chest with every breath. He is too weak to eat. His mother tries to force a little watered-down ale between his lips. The father feels a surge of helpless rage. Is this God's will? Did a neighbor cast a spell? The boy's fight for breath becomes the only sound in the hovel, a terrifying rhythm that counts down the remaining hours of his life. His death would not be a singular tragedy. It would be a common, expected, and accepted part of the winter landscape. A fresh wound in the heart of a family that had no time to grieve before facing their own struggle for survival. The psychological dimension of this constant sickness was immense. It created a culture of fatalism and resignation. Death was not a distant, sanitized event. It happened right there, in the single room, witnessed by the entire family. The sick were not isolated in hospitals. They suffered and died in the midst of life. This constant proximity to illness and death shaped the medieval worldview, infusing it with a sense of the world's fragility and the urgency of securing a good afterlife. The memento mori, "Remember you must die," was not just an artistic theme, it was a lived reality, most poignantly in the long, dark, sickly months of winter. Sickness was the final turn of the screw, the force that took the miserable conditions of winter and translated them into a direct, physical assault that shattered bodies, broke spirits, and populated the quiet, frozen landscape with fresh graves. We have constructed a grim portrait of the medieval winter, a season of profound darkness, of penetrating cold, of gnawing hunger, and of rampant sickness. These forces combined to lay siege to every household in the land. This state of siege leads us to the fifth great hardship, a complex and deeply paradoxical trial that strikes at the very core of human purpose, the nature of labor and its absence. The medieval winter was defined by a cruel duality. It was a time of brutally difficult, often dangerous and essential work, performed under the worst possible conditions. Simultaneously, it was a season of vast, empty, and agonizingly long periods of enforced idleness. This oscillation between exhausting toil and anxious inactivity created a unique form of psychological and physical torment. Let us first dismantle the romantic notion of winter as a time of rest. For the medieval peasant, rest was a luxury they could ill afford. The cycle of life and death did not pause for the snow. The primary and most relentless demand was the care of their livestock. These animals were not pets. They were the peasant family's most critical economic assets, their living machinery and their protein bank. The oxen were the tractors of the medieval world, their muscle power essential for the spring ploughing. The family's single milch cow provided a precious trickle of milk, cheese, and butter, a vital source of fat and protein. The sheep provided the wool that clothed the family and the lambs for future growth. The pigs, fattened on scraps, were the main source of preserved meat. The failure to keep these animals alive through the winter was not an inconvenience. It was a sentence of economic ruin for the year to come. The daily routine of animal husbandry became a Herculean struggle against the elements. Consider the first task of the day, performed in the pre-dawn darkness. The peasant would rise from his straw pallet into the frigid, smoky air of the hovel. His first duty was to the animals. Fodder, the hay and dried grasses so laboriously cut and stacked during the summer, had to be retrieved from the rick or the corner of the barn. This supply was the village's lifeline, and it was rationed with excruciating care. The peasant would have a mental tally of how much fodder was left, measured against an unknown quantity, the length of the winter. Every armful he distributed was a debit from a rapidly dwindling account. He would watch the animals eat, their survival for another day secured, but his own anxiety deepening. Then came the chore of watering, a task of Sisyphean misery. The village pond or stream, the primary source, would be sealed under a thick lid of ice. The peasant would have to take a heavy axe or iron-shod pole and begin the jarring, exhausting work of smashing a hole. The percussive shock of each blow would travel up his arms into his shoulders. The ice could be a foot thick or more. After many minutes of this brutal work, he would finally break through to the dark, freezing water below. He would then dip his wooden buckets, his hands plunging into the icy water, becoming instantly numb and agonizingly painful as the blood retreated. He would then have to haul the heavy buckets, water sloshing over the sides and freezing instantly to his legs and the ground, back to the animals. The path would become a treacherous slick of ice. A fall could mean a sprained ankle, a broken wrist, or worse, a catastrophic injury in a world without orthopedic surgery. This entire painful process had to be repeated multiple times every single day for months on end. And then there was the mucking out. The animals, confined to a small space, produced a constant stream of waste. This manure, mixed with straw bedding, had to be removed regularly to prevent the buildup of ammonia fumes and disease. In the cold, the mixture would freeze into a solid, heavy mass. The peasant would have to use a heavy, three-pronged fork to hack it apart and lift the frozen, steaming clumps. He would then have to transport this heavy load to the communal midden heap, where it would compost and become the precious fertilizer for the spring fields. It was foul-smelling, back-breaking work that left him sweating despite the freezing air, a dangerous combination that could lead to a sudden chill and sickness. The second great pillar of winter labor was the unceasing quest for fuel. The hearth fire was not a luxury for ambiance. It was the engine of survival. It provided the only heat, the only light for cooking, and a marginal defense against the crushing dark. But it was insatiably hungry. The right of estover, the permission to gather fallen wood from the Lord's domain, transformed from a simple autumn task into a desperate daily struggle. Let us follow a peasant woman on this mission. She wraps her woolen cloak tightly around herself and steps out into a silent, white world. The snow is deep, perhaps up to her knees, making every step a conscious effort of lifting and plunging. The cold is a physical presence, stinging her cheeks and making her eyes water. She heads for the woods, her mind focused on a single objective, finding anything that will burn. The familiar forest is now a strange and hostile place. The snow blankets everything, hiding the deadwood she seeks. She uses a long stick to probe the drifts, feeling for the telltale resistance of a buried branch. When she finds one, the real work begins. She has to dig it out with her bare, numb hands, the snow melting against her skin and chilling her to the bone. The wood is often frozen to the ground or entangled with other frozen branches. She has to pull, kick, and wrestle it free. Her hands become raw, her muscles ache. After an hour of this relentless searching, she may only have a small, pathetic bundle of damp, frozen sticks. She then faces the journey home, laden with her meager prize. The wood is heavy and awkward. The journey back, uphill through the snow, is a grueling test of endurance. She arrives back at the hovel, exhausted, soaked, and freezing, and the wood she has gathered will produce more smoke than heat. And she knows, with a sinking heart, that she will have to do it all again tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. The fear of the fire going out was a primal existential dread. Beyond these daily survival tasks, there was other specialized winter work. For those with the skills, it was the season for forestry. The cold made the sap descend in the trees, making the timber harder and more durable. Teams of woodsmen would venture into the great forests, their axes ringing in the cold, clear air. It was dangerous work. An axe could slip on frozen bark. A massive tree, its fall cushioned and made unpredictable by deep snow, could kill a man instantly. But the timber was vital for building, for tool-making, and for the Lord's construction projects. In the relative shelter of the barns, men would spend endless hours threshing the harvested grain. This was done with a flail, a simple but effective tool. The rhythmic, monotonous thud of the flail against the grain heads on the threshing floor was a characteristic sound of winter. The air would be thick with fine, sharp chaff and dust, which inflamed the lungs and caused a chronic thresher's cough. It was repetitive, exhausting work, but it was essential to convert the harvested sheaves into edible grain. Yet, despite this catalogue of brutal labor, the great paradox of winter was the sheer volume of empty time. The sun, a miserly tyrant, granted only a few hours of usable light. Once the sun set in the mid-afternoon, most outdoor work became impossible and dangerous. This plunged the peasant family into a vast, dark ocean of time, a period of enforced idleness that was not restful, but deeply corrosive. Let us return to the hovel as the grey afternoon light fades into impenetrable blackness. The family is gathered inside. The essential chores are done. 16 hours of darkness stretch before them. The space is cramped, smoky, and cold. The psychological pressure of this confinement was immense. Imagine the same small group of people in the same small, smelly room for months on end. There was no privacy, no escape. Every cough, every sigh, every movement was shared. The modern concept of cabin fever, irritability, restlessness, and depression from prolonged confinement would have been a universal, seasonal affliction. What could they possibly do to fill these hours? The primary activity for women was the slow, meticulous process of making textiles. This was not a hobby. It was a vital economic contribution. A woman would take out her distaff, a stick holding a bundle of carded wool, and her spindle. With practiced, almost subconscious movements, she would draw out the fibers and twist them into yarn as the spindle spun and dropped towards the floor. It was a skill that could be performed in low light, almost by touch alone. The yarn she produced would clothe her family. Any surplus could be woven into cloth and sold or bartered at market, providing one of the few sources of independent income for women. This endless spinning was the physical rhythm that underscored the long winter nights. Men's tasks were more limited by the lack of light. They might sit close to the fire, trying to mend a leather strap, sharpen a tool, or carve a wooden peg. But the flickering, unreliable light made detailed work difficult and frustrating, leading to eye strain and headaches. More often than not, their primary activity was simply sitting, waiting. This waiting was not peaceful. It was a breeding ground for anxiety. In the quiet darkness, with only the sound of the wind and the crackle of the fire, the mind would inevitably turn to the family's precarious situation. They would be acutely aware of their dwindling resources. The father might mentally picture the grain bin, estimating how many weeks of bread were left. The mother might think of the salted meat barrel, knowing that each piece removed brought them closer to a diet of plain gruel. They would listen to the cough of a child, and a spike of fear would go through them. They would worry about the weather, listening to the intensity of the wind, wondering if it signaled a blizzard that would trap them for days. This gnawing anxiety, with no distraction to relieve it, was a form of mental torture. To combat the crushing boredom and fear, the main recourse was the human voice. The winter hovel was the theatre of the oral tradition. This was when the stories were told. The grandparents, the repositories of communal memory, would speak. They would recount the great epic poems, the lives of the saints, the fables of cunning animals, and the terrifying local legends of ghosts, demons, and the fairy folk who inhabited the nearby woods and mounds. These stories were not just for entertainment. They were a way of making sense of a dangerous and unpredictable world. They reinforced social norms, transmitted religious beliefs, and provided a shared cultural landscape that bound the family and community together. The children, their eyes wide in the firelight, would absorb these tales, and they, in turn, in their own old age, would pass them on. They would also sing. Ballads telling of great battles, tragic love affairs, or heroic deeds would be sung from memory. The music, simple and unaccompanied, would fill the small space, providing a brief, beautiful respite from the misery of their condition. Simple games, using carved bone dice or a game board scratched into the floor, offered another small diversion. But these activities, however vital, could not fill the sheer emptiness of the time. The idleness was a heavy blanket, smothering the spirit. The medieval church recognized this danger, framing idleness not as rest, but as a spiritual vulnerability. An idle mind was seen as fertile ground for sin, for despair, and for temptation by the devil. The repetitive meditative rhythm of reciting prayers like the Paternoster or the Ave Maria on a string of beads, the Rosary, was encouraged as a way to occupy the mind and fortify the soul against the darkness, both literal and spiritual. Thus, the peasant was caught in a cruel trap. The day demanded exhausting physical labor under brutal conditions, depleting the body. The night offered not recovery, but a vast, empty space that invited boredom, anxiety, and spiritual dread, depleting the mind. It was a cycle of being physically overwrought and mentally understimulated, a wearing down of the whole person. This unique and grueling combination of hard labor and hard idleness was one of the most insidious and defining hardships of the long medieval winter. We have walked through a gallery of grim portraits, each depicting a facet of the medieval winter's brutality. We have felt the primordial tyranny of the darkness, a force that stole the hours of the day and populated the night with fear. We have shivered with the invasive, relentless cold, an enemy that laid siege to the very marrow of the bones. We have known the slow, grinding ache of hunger, a countdown to starvation measured in handfuls of flour. We have witnessed the terror of sickness in a world without understanding, and we have grappled with the cruel paradox of labor, a cycle of dangerous toil and corrosive idleness. But these forces, as terrible as they were, did not operate on individuals in a vacuum. They operated on a society, and their most insidious effect, the force that acted as a silent, powerful multiplier for every other hardship, was the dissolution of community itself. This sixth great trial was isolation, a force that shattered the medieval world from the outside in, leaving each family, each soul, terrifyingly alone. To comprehend the sheer horror of this isolation, we must first paint a vivid picture of what was lost. We must resurrect, in our minds, the medieval summer. Summer was the season of rampant, unrestrained communalism. The very landscape demanded it. The open field system meant that the village's arable land was not a patchwork of private, fenced-off farms, but a great open tapestry of narrow, individual strips of land. A peasant's holdings were scattered across these great fields, intermingled with his neighbours. This system made collective action a necessity. The village shared its heavy ploughs and its teams of precious oxen, working together to break the soil in the spring. They coordinated the planting of crops, the weeding, and the desperate, frantic labour of the harvest. A man's survival was quite literally intertwined with his neighbours. The sounds of the summer village were the sounds of community in action. The day would begin with the lowing of cattle being led out to the common pasture, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer on anvil, the rhythmic thud of women beating laundry against stones at the stream, and the constant cheerful noise of children playing in the dusty lanes. The air itself was thick with shared life. Social interaction was not an event to be scheduled. It was the constant, ambient condition of existence. Women gathered at the village well, the social hub, exchanging news, gossip, and advice as they drew water. Men shared a clay pipe of tobacco or a horn of ale at the end of a long day's work, their talk of weather and crops a vital exchange of information. Life was lived in public, under the broad, benevolent gaze of the sun. The village was a single, breathing organism. Even its festivals were affirmations of this shared identity. The fertility rites of May Day, the lighting of the great bonfires on Midsummer's Eve, the harvest home celebrations, all were moments when the community came together to assert its unity against the unpredictable forces of nature. The arrival of winter was the death of this world. It was a cataclysm that systematically dismantled every strut and beam of the communal structure. The first and most dramatic severance was the physical isolation of the village as a whole. As the autumn rains turned the dirt roads into impassable quagmires of sucking mud, and the first hard frosts turned that mud into a landscape of jagged, frozen daggers, the arteries of communication and commerce began to clot. Then came the snow, a soft, silent conqueror, burying the world under a thick, seamless blanket of white. The roads, poor as they were, vanished completely. A familiar track became an unmarked, treacherous wilderness. Deep drifts, sculpted by the wind, could block a path entirely, creating walls of snow taller than a man. For weeks, and sometimes for months, the village became a planet unto itself, cut off from the rest of the universe. The weekly or bi-weekly visit from the peddler, a man who was a living newspaper and a mobile marketplace, ceased. His arrival in summer was a small festival, a moment of excitement bringing needles, ribbons, salt, spices, and crucially, news from the outside. Tales of the king's court, rumours of war, stories from the next county. His absence in winter created a profound silence, a void of information that left the village floating in a timeless, eventless limbo. The world beyond the parish boundaries might as well have ceased to exist. This isolation was an economic strangulation. The surplus cloth that the women had spent the autumn weaving, a vital source of cash for the household, could not be taken to market. The carefully crafted cheeses, the barrels of ale, any small product of peasant industry became worthless if it could not be transported. Conversely, the village could not acquire what it could not produce. If the local salt supply ran low, there was no more to be had. If the blacksmith's stock of iron was depleted, a broken ploughshare could not be repaired, a potentially catastrophic failure on the eve of spring. The village was forced to turn inward and consume itself, its economy shrinking to the stark, brutal reality of what was contained within its own snowbound borders. This created a shipwreck mentality. A deep and pervasive anxiety born of the knowledge that there would be no rescue, no resupply. They were utterly on their own. This macro-isolation was mirrored with devastating precision on the micro level within the village itself. The once unified social organism of summer atomized into a collection of isolated, competing family units. The physical difficulty of moving about was the primary agent of this internal fracture. The simple, neighborly act of popping in became a major expedition. One would have to bundle up, step out into the biting cold, and navigate a landscape designed to injure. Icy paths could send a person sprawling, resulting in a broken bone that would likely lead to a winter of agony and potential disability. Deep, heavy snow made every step a draining effort. For the elderly, the infirm, or a woman in the late stages of pregnancy, leaving the hovel was simply out of the question. They were prisoners, confined to their smoky, dark cells for the duration of the season. The result was the death of casual society. The village green, the hub of summer life, was a barren, empty expanse of snow. The churchyard, a place for social gathering after the Sunday service, was deserted. The constant, life-affirming hum of the summer village was replaced by a profound and unnerving silence, broken only by the mournful howl of the wind. This sensory deprivation was psychologically disorienting. It felt as if the world had died, leaving only one's own small, beleaguered household afloat in a sea of nothingness. This internal isolation fell hardest upon the most vulnerable, transforming them from members of a community into solitary castaways. Let us imagine, in detail, the world of an elderly widow we shall call Elspeth. In summer, she is a known and valued part of the village fabric. Though her body is frail, her mind is sharp, and she is a keeper of stories, of herbal remedies, of the village's history. Her neighbors greet her as she sits in the sun by her doorway. Children bring her wildflowers, and she is never truly alone. Now, it is January. The snow is piled high against her wattle and daub walls. The cold has seeped into her bones, and the ache in her joints is a constant, grinding torment. She is unable to make the perilous journey for firewood herself. Her small, precious stock is dwindling. She rations it mercilessly, spending most of her days huddled under a thin woolen blanket in the near darkness, the fire reduced to a handful of barely glowing embers. She is hungry. Her small store of dried peas is gone, and she is down to a small sack of coarse barley flour. She mixes it with snow to make a thin, insipid gruel. The silence in her hovel is absolute. She can no longer hear the sounds of the village, only the creaking of her roof timbers and the frantic beating of her own heart. Her human contact has ceased. Her neighbors, locked in their own desperate struggles for survival, have no energy to spare to check on her. They assume she is managing. Her fear is a living thing. What if she falls? What if her fire goes out completely? What if she succumbs to the racking cough that has taken hold of her chest? No one will know. She is invisible. The community that had defined her entire life has vanished, and she is left to face death in solitary confinement. Her fate was the unspoken fear of every aging peasant. This pervasive isolation, this severing of human connection, created a psychological pressure cooker. The human mind, deprived of external stimuli and social release, turns inward, and often it turns toxic. Within the cramped hovel, the same few faces seen day after day, the same smells, the same fears. It was a recipe for conflict. Minor irritations would fester, growing into bitter resentments. The way a spouse chewed their bread, the whining of a hungry child, the snoring of a grandparent. These small things, repeated endlessly in the tense, confined space, could become unbearable. And when misfortune struck, as it inevitably did, the mind, desperate for a cause, would often fixate on the nearest available target, the neighbor. This is the dark soil from which the winter witchcraft accusation grew. It was not a simple superstition. It was a social pathology born of fear and isolation. Let us trace its grim progression. A family's precious cow, their only source of milk and cheese, falls sick. The animal grows thin, its milk sours, and it refuses to eat. The family tries every folk remedy they know, every prayer, but the animal weakens. They are facing ruin. Their children's already meager diet will become even more perilous. In their terror and powerlessness, they need a reason, an agent, someone to blame. Their minds sift through the village's social landscape, They remember an argument with a neighbor a month ago over a straying chicken. They recall that the neighbor's wife, a sharp-tongued woman, had muttered something under her breath as she stormed off. Or perhaps their suspicion falls on an outsider, a person who doesn't quite fit, like Elspeth, the solitary widow. Her knowledge of herbs, a source of respect in summer, is now reinterpreted as a sign of sinister power. In the paranoid echo chamber of the winter hovel, suspicion quickly calcifies into a certainty that feels as solid as the frozen earth outside. A curse has been laid. Malevolent will is at work. This accusation, at first a private thought, is whispered to another isolated family. It finds fertile ground. That family, too, has suffered a misfortune. Soon, the rumor spreads like a contagion through the disconnected cells of the village. The accused, completely unaware at first, begins to feel the change. Neighbors avert their gaze. People make the sign of the cross as they pass. They are no longer a person. They are a vessel for the community's collective anxiety, a scapegoat upon whom all the winter's misery can be projected. This social death was often a prelude to a physical one. The community, far from being a source of protection, had become a deadly threat. Even the formal institutions meant to bind society together failed. The cold, empty church offered little solace. The feudal system was exposed as a hollow promise. The lord was a distant abstraction, safe and warm in his great stone keep, while his tenants suffered. The reeve, his local enforcer, was viewed with fear and suspicion, the man who would come to collect the lord's dues, not to distribute his aid. The most tragic casualty of this isolation was the unwritten law of mutual support, the moral economy of the village. In summer, helping a neighbor was a natural, reciprocal act. In the depths of a brutal winter, it became a terrible moral quandary. Imagine a peasant, his own children weak and listless from hunger, hearing the cries of his neighbor's starving child through the thin wall of the hovel. He has a single, small loaf of bread left to feed his own family for 2 days. To share it would be an act of supreme Christian charity, but it might also be the act that tips his own child over the edge from hunger into death. It is a choice of unimaginable agony. In most cases, the primal biological imperative to protect one's own offspring had to prevail. This was not a failure of character, it was a failure of circumstance, a tragedy imposed by the brutal mathematics of scarcity. And so, the community died a slow death each winter. It atomized, breaking down from a cohesive whole into its constituent, desperate parts. The we of the summer harvest became the us versus them of the winter famine. This profound isolation, this stripping away of the social and psychological scaffolding that made life meaningful and survivable, was the silent, overarching torture of the medieval winter. It turned every other hardship from a shared burden into a solitary agony, leaving each soul to confront the long, dark, hungry night alone. Winter in the medieval mind was not merely a season, it was a malevolent entity, a conscious force, and its primary weapon was fear. This was not the fleeting acute fear of a sudden fright, it was a chronic condition, a slow-acting poison that seeped into every thought, every dream, every prayer for months on end. It was a great tangled hydra, and each of its heads represented a distinct and terrifying aspect of the winter ordeal. Let us first confront the most ancient and primal of these fears, the fear of the cosmos itself. We, in our modern age, are armed with the cold, comforting certainty of celestial mechanics. We know the Earth is tilted on its axis. We know the winter solstice is a precise, predictable, and inanimate turning point in an orbital journey. The medieval peasant possessed no such certainty. To them, the sun was not a distant ball of gas. It was the giver of all life, a benevolent and powerful being. Its slow, agonizing retreat during the autumn months was not a matter of planetary tilt. It was a sign that this great being was weakening, sickening, or perhaps abandoning them. This fear was a deep, ancestral memory, a holdover from the pagan soul of Europe that Christianity had coated but not erased. As the days grew terrifyingly short, as the sun appeared as a pale, watery disk that skimmed the southern horizon before vanishing with indecent haste, a genuine existential dread would take hold. What if this is the end? What if this time, the great wheel of the year jams and fails to turn? What if the sun's retreat is not temporary, but final? This was the great fear, the foundational terror that the world itself was dying and that humanity would be left to perish in a final, endless night. The frantic, fire-lit rituals of the winter solstice, the Yule logs, the bonfires, were not merely celebrations. They were desperate acts of sympathetic magic, great offerings of man-made light and heat intended to plead with, to bargain with, to magically coax the fading sun back to life. Every peasant who looked up at the weak, anemic sun felt this deep, cosmic dread in their very soul. From this existential terror cascaded a host of more immediate, tangible fears. There was the fear of the elements, a fear born of constant physical vulnerability. The cold was a relentless predator. The peasant feared the moment in the deepest night when the fire, banked carefully with ash, might finally die. To wake up in a hovel where the hearth was a heap of cold, dead ashes was to wake up in a tomb. The cold would rush in, unopposed, and the struggle to relight a fire with numb, clumsy fingers and crude flint and steel was a desperate race against a lethal chill. They feared the ice, the black, slick treachery that lay in wait on every path. A simple fall could mean a shattered hip or a compound fracture of the leg, an injury that, in the absence of modern medicine, meant either a slow, agonizing death from infection or a lifetime of crippling disability. They feared the insidious creep of frostbite, watching with terror as a child's fingers turned a waxy, unnatural white, knowing that this was the first step toward the blackened, dead flesh of gangrene, and the horrific choice between amputation with a crude knife or the certainty of a spreading, fatal corruption. The darkness, as we have seen, was not empty. It was crowded with things to fear. The most real of these were the wolves. In summer, they kept to the deep forests, but a long, hard winter would drive them, gaunt and ravenous with hunger, to the very edges of the village. The sound of a wolf pack howling in the near distance was not a romantic call of the wild. It was a terrifying declaration of intent, a sound that spoke of sharp teeth and empty bellies. It was a sound that made a mother pull her children closer and a father check the flimsy bar on his door for the 10th time. Stories, all too often true, would circulate of livestock being taken, or even of a lone traveler or a stray child vanishing into the twilight. But the fear of the dark went far beyond the wolves. The darkness was the realm of the supernatural, the time when the veil between the world of the living and the world of the spirits grew thin to the point of transparency. The peasant feared the restless dead, the draga of Norse tradition, who were believed to rise from their burial mounds, filled with a malevolent hatred for the living. They feared the demonic, the unholy things that roamed the night, seeking to lead souls astray. And they feared the wild hunt, a terrifying pan-European myth of a spectral hunting party thundering across the winter night sky. Led by a horned god or a damned soul, with a pack of phantom hounds with eyes of fire, the hunt was a horrifying omen. To hear its approach was terror enough. To witness it was to risk having your soul snatched away to join its dreadful cavalcade for eternity. The hovel, with its thin walls and its flickering firelight casting monstrous, dancing shadows, felt like a pitifully inadequate fortress against a night that was alive and hostile. Then there was the slow, methodical fear of the dwindling larder. This was a fear that could be seen, touched, and measured. It was the fear a peasant felt when he plunged his wooden scoop into the grain bin and heard it scrape against the wooden bottom sooner than expected. It was the fear in a woman's heart as she counted the last few smoked fish hanging from the soot-blackened rafters. It was a fear that manifested as a constant, low-level anxiety, a grim, internal accounting. There are 20 loaves worth of flour left. The spring thaw is perhaps 8 weeks away. Will it be enough? Every meal, every piece of bread handed to a hungry child was a subtraction from a finite sum, a step closer to the hungry gap when the food would run out entirely. This fear was particularly acute for parents who would often give their own meager portions to their children, feeling the gnawing emptiness in their own stomachs while consumed with the terror of not being able to provide. And layered over all of this was the fear of the body's own betrayal, the fear of sickness. As we've explored, illness was a mystery and therefore doubly terrifying. A cough was not a virus. It was a sign of a deep humoral imbalance, a disharmony that could unravel one's very being. A fever was not a sign of the immune system at work. It was a consuming fire, a sign that the body was at war with itself. The peasant feared the unknown, the invisible agent that could lay a strong man low or steal the breath from a beloved child. They feared their own powerlessness, the terrible reality of being able to do nothing but watch a loved one suffer, offering only useless herbal potions and desperate prayers. This fear was intimate and absolute. This cascade of fears, cosmic, elemental, physical, supernatural, and internal, created a state of chronic, unyielding stress. It was a psychological siege that lasted for a third of the year. In the face of such an overwhelming onslaught of dread, hope was not a gentle luxury. It was a desperate, essential, and actively waged campaign. It was the crucial counterinsurgency fought in the landscape of the soul. The greatest fortress of hope was the church. It provided a powerful narrative that gave meaning to suffering. The peasant was taught that their miserable, frozen, hungry existence was not the totality of reality. It was merely a brief, painful pilgrimage, a testing ground. Suffering was not random. It was a tool used by God to purify the soul, to test faith, to allow the believer to share in a small part of the passion of Christ. This worldview, internalized from birth, was a powerful psychological shield. It transformed a meaningless agony into a purposeful trial, promising that for every moment of earthly suffering, an eternity of bliss awaited the faithful in the next life. This promise of paradise was the ultimate, unassailable hope. The liturgical calendar was a practical roadmap for this journey of hope. The season of Advent was a period of darkness and waiting, but it was structured waiting, filled with anticipation for the coming light. And then, at the very nadir of the year, at the point of maximum darkness, the church placed its most joyous festival, Christmas. The timing was a deliberate, brilliant act of theological and psychological warfare against despair. The message was clear and powerful. It is precisely when the darkness is deepest that the light of the world is born. The carols, the evergreens brought into the home as symbols of eternal life, the precious candles lit in the church, these were not just decorations. They were weapons in the war against fear, acts of defiant belief in the triumph of light and life. The calendar then provided further milestones of hope. Candlemas in February, with its blessing of the candles that would light the home for the rest of the year, a tangible promise of the light's steady return. Hope was also cultivated in the small, daily victories of survival. The first, crucial act of hope each day was the rekindling of the fire. The peasant, blowing gently on the banked embers, seeing the first tiny red glow, then the first small lick of flame, was not just starting a fire. They were reenacting the creation of the world, pushing back the cold and the dark for one more day. It was a potent, daily ritual of renewal. The sound of the family cow, alive and chewing her cud in the corner of the hovel, was the sound of future milk, future cheese, future life. The rhythmic, meditative act of a woman spinning thread was an act of profound faith in the future. She was not just making yarn, she was spinning tomorrow's warmth, crafting a tangible hope that her family would see the spring. The community, though fractured, could also be a source of shared hope. In the endless darkness of the hovel, storytelling was the loom upon which hope was woven. The old tales of heroes who overcame impossible odds, of clever girls who outwitted monstrous giants, of faithful saints who endured unimaginable torture. These stories provided a script for resilience. They taught that courage, cunning, and faith were tools that could defeat even the most terrifying of adversaries. They created a shared, imaginative world where justice, however distant, was possible, providing a vital escape from the grim reality of the present. A song, sung in unison, a simple melody rising against the sound of the wind, was a powerful affirmation of shared existence. A tiny spark of communal warmth pushed back against the isolating cold. And finally, there was the hope that came from the earth itself. After the false thaws and the recurring frosts of late winter, the first true signs of spring were the most powerful antidote to despair. It would begin subtly, a peasant, attuned to the rhythms of the natural world, would notice that the sun's arc was infinitesimally higher, that its light had a new, less watery quality. They would see the first trickle of meltwater from a snowbank. They would break open a willow twig and see the faint green of new life within. And then, the undeniable miracles would appear. The first, impossibly brave snowdrop pushing its white head through the frozen ground. The bright yellow defiance of a celandine. The first call of a returning lapwing. Each of these was a message, a dispatch from the front line of the war against winter, declaring that the siege was breaking. The sight of the first new blades of grass, a vibrant, shocking green against the drab brown of the thawing earth, was the ultimate symbol of resurrection. It was the tangible, irrefutable proof that the world was not dead, that life was returning, that the long, terrible battle for survival had been won for one more year. It was the final, triumphant blossoming of hope. We have now traveled through the 7 great circles of the medieval winter's hell. We have felt the closing walls of the unending darkness and the penetrating chill of the relentless cold. We have known the slow, internal erosion of hunger and the mysterious, terrifying assault of sickness. We have experienced the cruel paradox of body-breaking labor and soul-destroying idleness, and we have witnessed the very fabric of community unravel into the threads of a profound and fearful isolation. Finally, we have stood in the heart of the winter prisoner, caught in the desperate, oscillating struggle between an all-encompassing fear and the fragile, flickering candle of hope. And now, we arrive at the 8th and final trial. This is not another distinct hardship, but the brutal, ambiguous, and exhausting transition out of the prison. This is the thaw, the reckoning, and the dawn of a new tyranny. It is the end of the siege, and the beginning of the desperate scramble to rebuild a shattered world. The end of winter was not a sudden, joyous event like the flicking of a switch. It was a slow, messy, and often deceptive process, a battle of attrition between the retreating forces of frost and the tentative vanguard of spring. It would begin with the subtlest of signs, perceptible only to those whose very survival depended on reading the language of the natural world. It might be a change in the quality of the light, a hint less grey, a touch more gold. It might be a new sound, the first hesitant drip of an icicle from the eaves of the hovel, a tiny percussive rhythm of hope that broke the months of frozen silence. Then would come the false springs, the cruelest of winter's final jests. A week of milder weather would cause the snow to recede, revealing the pale, dead grass beneath. The peasants, their hearts aching with a desperate hope, might dare to believe the ordeal was over. But then, inevitably, winter would return with a final, vicious roar, a late blizzard burying their hopes under a fresh blanket of white, a biting frost locking the world back into its icy grip. These false dawns were psychologically devastating, a reminder that winter would not relinquish its power easily. But eventually the change would become undeniable. The sun's climb higher into the sky would become noticeable, its warmth no longer a distant memory, but a faint, tangible sensation on the skin. The dripping of the icicles would become a steady trickle, then a gurgle. The snowpack, once a pristine white mantle, would grow grey and rotten, pockmarked and shrinking, releasing its vast store of captive water into the land. The soundscape of the world would transform. The dead silence of the frozen months would be replaced by the sound of a world weeping, a constant sound of dripping, running and gurgling as the streams and rivers began to break free from their icy shackles. This great thaw, however, was not a gentle liberation. It was a deluge. The frozen, impermeable ground could not absorb the sudden onslaught of meltwater. The result was a landscape transformed into a vast, shallow lake of mud and slush. The paths between houses, the lanes of the village, the fields themselves, all dissolved into a near impassable quagmire. If the thaw was accompanied by heavy spring rains, the streams and rivers would swell over their banks, causing widespread flooding that could inundate the low-lying cottages and wash away the precious topsoil from the fields. The world was no longer frozen solid, but it was now drowning, a different kind of prison. This was also the moment of the greatest hunger, the most dangerous point of the entire year. This was the hungry gap in its most acute and desperate form. The food stores from the previous autumn were now either completely gone or reduced to their final, pitiful dregs. The peasant family would be subsisting on the sweepings of the grain bin, a coarse, gritty flour perhaps bulked out with ground-up acorns or even tree bark to make a foul-tasting, barely nutritious bread. The pottage pot would contain little more than boiled water with the first tough nettle tops and wild garlic scrounged from the muddy ground. And it was at this moment, when the people were at their absolute weakest, their bodies emaciated, their muscles wasted, their joints aching from scurvy, their minds dulled by months of malnutrition and stress, that the most strenuous work of the year demanded to be done. The tyranny of winter was immediately replaced by the tyranny of the spring planting season. There was no period of gentle recovery. The relief of survival was instantly supplanted by a frantic race against time. The peasant man would have to venture out into the cold, sodden fields. He would have to ready the heavy wooden plough, a task made all the more difficult if its iron share had been broken during the autumn and could not be repaired. He would have to yoke his oxen, animals who were themselves just as gaunt and weakened as he was, having survived the winter on meagre rations of fodder. Then began the back-breaking work of ploughing. He would lean his entire, wasted body weight into the plough handles, trying to guide it in a straight furrow through the wet, heavy, clinging soil, while shouting encouragement to the straining, stumbling oxen. Each step was an agony, a monumental effort of will over a body that was screaming for rest. Behind him would come his wife, perhaps with the older children, walking the freshly turned earth. She would carry the seed horn, the vessel containing the most precious substance in their world, the seed corn that had been so carefully guarded through the winter, the untouchable portion that represented the future. With each step, she would scatter a small handful of these seeds, her mind performing a constant, anxious calculation. Scatter too thinly, and the crop will be sparse. Scatter too thickly, and the seed will run out before the fields are all sown. The fate of the next year's harvest, the very question of whether they would live or die, rested in the skill of her hand and the strength of her husband's back. This was also the time of the great reckoning. As the snow melted away, it revealed what the winter had hidden. The true cost of the siege was finally tallied. The bodies of those who had perished alone, like our imagined widow Elspeth, would be discovered in their cold, silent hovels, their absence finally confirmed. The community would have to count its dead, the infants who had succumbed to lung fever, the old who had faded away from hunger and cold. The village gravedigger would be busy, the newly softened earth receiving the casualties of winter's long war. The reckoning extended to the livestock as well. Each family would take stock of their animals. Had the cow survived? How many sheep had been lost to sickness or wolves? A family whose ox had died during the winter was facing a catastrophe, forced to try and beg or borrow a replacement, or even, in the most desperate cases, to yoke themselves to the plough. The village as a whole would see the cumulative losses, and a sense of collective grief and grim resolve would settle over them. They had survived, but they were scarred, weakened, and diminished. And yet, alongside this exhaustion and grief, new life was stirring. The return of the community was as slow and tentative as the return of the green shoots. As the ground began to dry, people would emerge from their hovels, blinking in the strengthening sunlight like creatures emerging from a long hibernation. The first face-to-face conversations with neighbours in months would take place. They were likely not joyous reunions, but sombre exchanges, the sharing of stories of loss and hardship, but they were contact. The terrible silence of isolation was broken. The social organism of the village began, slowly, to stitch itself back together. The sounds of life returned. The blacksmith's hammer would ring out, sharpening plowshares and repairing tools. The sounds of children's voices, released from the confines of the hovel, would once again be heard, their games still subdued, but a sign of life nonetheless. The parish church would begin to fill again, the community gathering not just to worship, but simply to be together, to see who had survived, to reaffirm their shared existence in the wake of the long trial. This, then, was the true nature of the medieval winter's end. It was not a simple, happy ending, but a complex, painful, and laborious rebirth. It was a time of immense relief, shadowed by immense grief. It was a time of hope for the future, mingled with the stark physical reality of present-day exhaustion and hunger. The peasants had weathered the darkness, the cold, and the famine. They had faced down their fears and held on to a stubborn hope. They had survived. And their reward for surviving the grueling siege of winter was to immediately begin the back-breaking labor of spring, to fight for the right to do it all over again. And now, our long journey through that distant, harsh, and brutal world is finally complete. The stories are told, the hardships of the past can now recede, fading like a dream upon waking, leaving behind only a deep sense of the peace, the warmth, and the profound security of your present moment. You are not in a cold, dark hovel. Your home is safe and warm. You are not hungry or sick. You are not isolated or afraid. You are here, now, in a place of perfect comfort and stillness. There are no more stories to follow, no more trials to endure. The journey is over. All that is left is to let go. Allow the last of these words to dissolve into the quiet of your room and let your mind drift away on the gentle, silent tide of a deep, peaceful, and truly restorative sleep. Good night.